Hello, everyone. Welcome to this event, which we planned as part of the digiloikka project for the MA degree program area and cultural studies, ALKU. In fact, Josephine and I came up with this idea that it would be helpful potentially and certainly interesting for some of us to get a sort of a mini toolkit for what you could consider using in teaching in case, as Josephine put it, in case you run out of ideas for online teaching. So basically this event is a combination of our attempts, our wish to use for students interesting digital tools that in teaching, but also to popularize the humanities research. Both, of course, inherently we think belong together. This is what we are trying to do. We are going to have 4 speakers today. I am sharing the program in a second. Which should work, I hope. Wonderful. So we have Josephine Hoegaerts and Lotta Vuorio who speak about podcasts. We have Anu Lahtinen with DigiBytes. We have Mikko Tolonen who speaks about virtual conferences. And we have me speaking about educational video games. We do not have a question and answer round planned. We thought we would present what we think could be helpful, useful, and also as we are recording this session, we hope to make it available to a broader audience, potentially via Tier de Colma. Without further ado, welcome everyone, and please let's proceed with our first speakers, Josephine and Lotta.
Thank you. I will start sharing my screen. All right, everyone can see it. Perfect. So, hi, behalf of me and Josephine, we are going to talk about podcasts, and our title is very intriguing: Podcasts Instead of Essays, a Practical Guide. So what could be more interesting than this? So let's start. First, a little introduction of our structure. First, I'm going to talk about podcasting, obviously. And then secondly, I will introduce our podcast series that I produced for this digiloikka project. It's called Podcasting Podcast. And thirdly, Josephine, we will talk about podcasts in teaching. So to introduce myself, why I am talking to you all today here is that in 2019 I graduated in the spring. I major in history, and at the moment I'm working on my PhD. But the same spring I worked as an assistant for digiloikka project, during which I created and produced one podcast series, which was my first one, and it inspired me to create my own podcast, like very own podcast, called Menneisyyden jäljillä, or in English, if you would translate it, it's On the Track of the Past. So I am talking here as an assistant for the project, but also as an experienced expert about podcasting while doing it myself at the moment, or since January this year. My own podcast Menneisyyden jäljillä is in Finnish. It's about history and it's trying to reach people outside the academia, so it's like covered the same themes that I'm talking here today. So why to podcast? I have maybe three main points, like why to use podcast in academic world to present your own research, or maybe talking about interesting subjects and themes. First is popularizing research. I think especially in history department, you hear sometimes the saying that history is a theme that people or that history should be written in a way that should be understandable for all in the first place. But even though we can agree that it's very good to make it available in the from the start, I think you can never be too simple or to explain too carefully things for a larger audience, because it's like it can be that, for example, when it comes to history, people, or it may be some time that people have attended their history lessons in school or something else, so you should never like overlook your audience, but talk as clearly and as simple way as possible, and it's not undermining your audience, it's working and serving for them. But also when I talk about popularizing research, I actually also mean the way you want to present your knowledge, that you, for example, in your research are coming up. And if you, for example, compare an ordinary research article versus blog posts or podcast or these kind of medias, I think it's obvious that it's not that easy to get the access, for example, to a research article that may be behind like or that you have to pay for the article if you're not attending to a university or these kind of things. So it's also polarizing in that sense, that you're making it accessible to others, which comes to my second point, that podcasting, it's an easy way to reach the famous larger audience. And why I am mentioning this famous is that during that I did this podcast in podcast series with Josephine, during the interviews, I think it was a great point that if you are reaching the larger audience and talking to everyone, then you're actually talking to no one. So it's very important to think that you should also always have in mind the specific audience that you are talking to, so that you present yourself in the most suitable way. But when I say that reaching the larger audience, I think it can be addressed in the way also when you're thinking about media platforms that you are present in your podcast, and in that way it actually is accessible for a larger audience. For example, through Spotify, iTunes, Google Podcasts, and these kind of forms that are free to use in certain amount of terms, but that they are in this way reaching the larger audience. And also to highlight that sometimes it's, or I think it's kind of usual nowadays, that podcasts also have some sort of social media accounts where they can, for example, inform about new episodes. So these are the ways to reach the audience through podcast. And the third point is that podcasting, it's cheap to produce. You need basically two things. One is the microphone, or maybe three, the one who talks to the microphone, but then also you need a space where to record the episode. And I think that even the second point, that where to record, is maybe even more important than the microphone, because the space is creating the quality for the recording. That if it's a large place where it echoes so much, it's very difficult, no matter what microphone, to have a good quality of the sound, except if you have a very good studio technology to do it. But like in usual circumstances, I have used, for example, I can only recommend Unitupe Studio from Helsinki University. It's in Alexandria building. But I have also, especially during the Corona spring, I recorded for my own podcasts, I think 6 episodes with my own recorder, which is Zoom H1, the model, and I think it costs around 80 euros. So I think that's not a bad investment for your podcast. And I recorded it under a blanket in my bedroom to minimize the echo. So I think the quality was surprisingly good in those circumstances. But I want to mention that besides the technology for the podcast, you may have to pay something for hosting the podcast, but it depends on the way that you are going to host and present your podcast. Then we're going to our podcast, and I am going to now play a little jingle from our Podcast in Podcast, episode 5.
Hello, this is Podcast in Podcast.
Hi, and welcome to the episode number 5 of Podcast in Podcast. Today we are going to talk about popularizing research, since it's basically the idea behind this podcast series as well. We have come a long way thinking about how to create an academic podcast. So far, we have a concept that the podcast is based on, and we know how to design one episode and how to do an interview. Now we are going to take a glance on how to formulate your academic knowledge into understandable form in order to reach your broader audience.
So here was a little sneak peek, so to say, about our podcast, which you can find on SoundCloud. I will show the link later. So the Podcast in Podcast, is a guide on how to start your own podcasting and what to take into consideration when you're designing it. It contains 6 episodes and have 3 main themes. The episodes are both in Finnish and in English. When it comes to 2 episodes, it basically like overlaps the themes in Finnish and in English to make it accessible to everyone maybe, but to that larger audience. Episodes 1 and 2 are about planning the concept, and it talks about the technicalities of how to set up your podcast. Episode number 3 is maybe my own favorite. It's about how to make an interview, and especially if you haven't used interviewing as a research method, for example, as in history at least, it's fair cases that you can interview the ones you're researching. I think it's a great episode to start with, and it's very useful to other occasions as well. Otherwise, or except the podcasting. Episodes 4 and 5 talk about popularizing research, and then episode 6 is me and Josephine talking about that what we have learned during the podcast and the course that this podcast was created for. But the podcast, I want to highlight that it's accessible to, and it can be used without the course that Josephine will talk about soon. But the Podcast in Podcast is, I would like to, for the end of my talking, to highlight 5 questions that we are thinking about and thinking through this podcast. So first, maybe how to be interesting, how to make your research interesting to others. Then how to structure one episode. We are taking the hand of the listener and walking it through, like how to structure an actual episode. How long will it be? Who are talking in an episode, and these kind of things. The third is about maybe the popularizing research and the question who I am talking to. As or in this 5th episode, our guest said beautifully that she wants to talk in her podcast like she would talk to a neighbor. So I think that's a very good way to thinking about popularizing research. 4th question is what kind of person I want to be when I interview. There are different styles, and it's important for everyone to find theirs. And the 5th question is that what is the key point for each episode. So what do I want? What is the message I want to give to the listener after he or she has listened to the episode? All right, Josephine, take over.
Thank you very much, Lotta. So as you have all heard, we now have this beautiful series of 6 podcast episodes that Lotta has recorded with various experts in the podcasting field. So you get this sort of introduction to how podcasting works, not only through Lotta herself, who is walking through all these steps, but also of people who sort of have a long-running podcast and who sort of know what they're doing, who can explain it. The podcast was developed as part of this digiloikka effort and was therefore designed to a degree for me to use in my own teaching. And I use quite a lot of sounding material because my research turns around sound. I teach on sound studies as well. And so this spring, I had the enormous privilege and joy to use the podcast series for the first time in teaching, and I thought this would be a good moment to, on the one hand, try to convince you why this is useful and why you could use it, but also to give a bit of sort of very practical information on how you can then do it practically in a sort of fairly easy way. Now, I think for most of us, some of the potential advantages of using podcasts are quite clear. We now all live in this remote working environment in which everything is online, so we've become perhaps a bit more convinced of why such things are reasonable or possible. But I would say like the most obvious reasons, I guess, for using podcasts in teaching would be firstly that it might prepare students for a working life that will require some fluency, at least, with the kind of digital tools that you need for podcasting, which is some basic editing software, use of a microphone. How do you make sure that your sound is decent? You know, the things that Lotta was talking about earlier, you know, recording under a blanket, things like that, which is a very simple thing, but maybe a skill that could be very, very useful for students when they just come out of school. And think about any sort of career in terms of cultural studies or any cultural organization where broadcasting has become quite a bit more important than it was 10 or 20 years ago. Specifically for the social sciences and the humanities, I would say that there's also an increasing need for people to not only know how to analyze mediatized material and media, but also to actually actively use them. And podcasting is one of these things that I think we're not necessarily teaching them already. This notion that, you know, audiovisual material has a sort of logic of its own, not only in terms of what we sort of consume, but also what we as knowledge makers produce. And then very practically, as Lotta already explained, it gives students a very achievable thing to do when they come out of university. Podcasting is a very cheap thing to do with something that sort of everybody can get into. So they don't need a lot of technology. They don't need to be part of a particular company or a particular place in order to start doing so, in order to start create content for themselves. And to then also have that as part of their CV, this sort of, you know, I'm capable of doing something on my own. I have produced something. I can do it again at a higher level. But I think those things are perhaps quite clear to most of us. What is less clear, I think, and what I had underestimated when I started teaching the course as well, is that podcasts can also really support the kind of teaching that we already do in the university in general, and maybe in the humanities and social sciences particularly. So all this traditional scholarly knowledge that we usually teach on paper is something that I think podcasts can be particularly good at doing as well. And it can help students to understand the basic premises of scholarly inquiry and transparent presentation in ways that I think other ways of teaching perhaps don't necessarily. So the first thing that I think I came across is how much support it gives people in terms of thinking about narrative, having to actually edit and time their own presentation really forces students to think about the structure of their presentation. How understandable all of it is. Does it have a beginning, a middle, and an end? Where are you going with this argument? And these are the questions we constantly ask when students write papers, and it can sometimes be a quite difficult conversation because it's not necessarily the most natural form of communication. Whereas for a lot of students, I found doing this in speech really encouraged them to think about, okay, what is my message and how do I want to get this across? And can I sort of tweak this again, or can I re-record it to make sure that I have a clear narrative? So I think it really helps to sort of think through structure and narrative. Secondly, it helps them think about their own, what we would usually call authorial voice, like who they are as scholars, in a sense, having to actually speak their argument. Encourages students to think of themselves as someone who creates content, as someone who creates knowledge, who has something to say. It also underlines that they are speaking to someone in particular. Lotta was just talking about this famous broader audience, which of course consists of no one. By the same token, you can also think about what your audience might be and sort of target a particular kind of audience to think about. And what you see on the slide here, for example, is the result of one exercise that the students get at the very beginning of the course, which is to visualize what their audience would be like. Who do they want to reach? Who are the people they want to sort of convince or talk to? Which again is something I think that we do quite often when we assign papers, but then maybe fail to really convey what that means. Whereas thinking through it in terms of somebody who sits at home and listens to something on the radio or on a podcast is a fairly concrete thing to think about, and therefore helps students to really frame what they're trying to do. And then finally, and this was perhaps the most surprising outcome for me, is that it really helps students to think about the basic ethics of scholarship and of how scholarship works on a practical level. Which is to say, it sort of helps them to think about what footnotes are and how they should work, which is a very sort of practical thing to do, but a fairly useful one, I think. So what I found out was that when students read out a quote, rather than just writing it in a paper, they are much more aware of the different voices that are at work in a particular narrative. So when you have to actually voice somebody else's opinion, it becomes very, very clear to you that that's what you're doing, that you're sort of ventriloquizing somebody else. And so I found that a lot of students became very, very precise in terms of, okay, this is my argument, this is my opinion, this is secondary literature I have been using, and I'm now being very, very clear about Professor X has found out, or this particular writer has made an argument about. And then also primary material where, you know, they have to find new ways to present that because it doesn't quite work like paper, right? You can't just add a little footnote. You have to be very, very particular about the kind of material that you're using. This is even more the case when you're using interviews as well, of course. You invite another expert into the room, and it becomes very obvious that scholarship is this collaborative process in which it's not just you coming up with brilliant ideas, but it's, you know, people talking to each other and coming up with arguments and thinking through particular problems. So I would say that those three are perhaps the most important reasons to try and think about podcasts as one way of conveying not only new knowledge, but also sort of very traditional humanities, social sciences kind of skills in a teaching situation. Practically then, how do we get all this podcasting done? And I think we can go to the next slide here. As Lotta has already told you, the podcasting series that she has made specifically for the course is available to all, and you're very, very free to use it. What I've done in addition to that is made a companion website, which has all these episodes and sort of lays out a process for students that they can essentially go through on their own if they want to, where in 5 steps they sort of build one 10 to 15 minutes episode, which could be used as a sort of replacement for a classic paper. So what the website contains essentially is these 5 steps, and in each case there's one episode. There's a couple of guiding questions for them to sort of think through, okay, what am I trying to learn from this episode? But there's also always a practical assignment to write a little piece of the introduction, for example, or to try out an interview, or to sit with another student and think through what the audience is, things like that. So it's a very sort of practical, down-to-earth kind of thing. Aside from those 5 steps, there are practical resources for the actual recording and editing of that episode, which has mainly been put together by Lotta, who has sort of, you know, brought together existing resources, but then also has made a couple of very simple cheat sheets on how to use free software. So it's something everybody can use as well. And it gives you a very quick introduction into, okay, I have a recording of something. How do I turn this into something, you know, decent and something somebody else might want to listen to? In addition to that, for people who teach at Helsinki University, you can give students access to the Unitube studio if they really want to go for like good quality sound. And I do have a couple of microphones that can be given on loan to students. So do get in touch if that's something you would like to use or try with your students. And then what the website also has is a couple of very, very quick guidelines on how to grade these assignments, which is, of course, one of these problems you then have when you do a bit of new teaching, is how do you make sure that you have like a clear and fair rubric. And a couple of the things maybe I would like to draw your attention to is that the podcasting not only has a number of benefits for students, I think, but also for teachers, in that it sort of forces us to think about assignments in a new way and think about teaching in a new way. For one, it forces us to go along really linearly with a student's narrative, which I found as I was doing is something I very rarely do. Usually when you read a paper, you read the introduction, you quickly flick to the conclusion, you have a sense of where it's going, and then you go through the whole thing, and you can sort of go back and forth as you wish. Which also means that you can have a very preconceived notion of what should be in that paper. You can't do that with a podcast. You have to start at the beginning and you have to listen to the end and sort of take their argument as it comes and take it seriously, which I think comes with a number of benefits of sort of trying to have that more conversational quality of how scholarship works also in teaching, particularly at an MA level where people are presenting their own research. It's a fairly helpful thing to sort of take that linear approach. So I think that collaborative notion of scholarship is really reflected back to you as a teacher when you're doing this kind of thing. And then finally, and this is maybe a nice note to end on, one of the beautiful things I found of assigning podcasts rather than essays is that, particularly now when we're all stuck in our own homes, the joy of listening to someone's voice rather than having, you know, a screen to look at or a sort of fairly impersonal piece of paper was really lovely. There's this little moment where for 20 minutes, you sort of have them in the room with you and you have not necessarily a two-way conversation, obviously, but some sense of we've made something and we've made it together. And now there's this moment where they actually get like these full 20 minutes of complete attention and time to the work they have done. Which I think helped me quite a bit in terms of thinking about my own work as a teacher as well during this whole remote teaching period. It can be a bit alienating to sit on your home alone. So having people's voices in my head was lovely. And I think that's sort of where I will leave you. We have one last slide with the practical information of where you can find all of this. And I can only encourage you to do so. Thank you.